mentioned the reduced nutrient density. We say we have an obesity problem in America. Not nearly as much an obesity problem as a micronutrient deficiency. What happens when the body can't digest something, especially a carbohydrate? Wants to get it out of the way, so it shunts it over as fat, deposits it around my waist. 1,800 or 2,000 calories should be burned by just any teenager squirming in front of a TV set. It's not, because we've turned the ignition off for a lot of those physiologic systems. Body wants to get it out of the way. Roundup Ready alfalfa. It's what we're feeding to our dairy cattle. Third less manganese. 18% less zinc. Only half the sulfur for those essential amino acids involved in the immune response, the glutathione, the cysteine, methionine. 46% less potassium. Where are they going to get the nutrient that used to come from the feed? You can see that it's not there. It's not compromising just the plant and its ability to photosynthesize. As you can see up in young and mature leaves, 48% less manganese. But look at what's in the seed that we're going to eat or that we're going to use to plant that new seedling needs that nutrient for. 6 years ago, I got a call from a veterinarian in northeast Iowa. He said, "What can you tell me about manganese?" I said, "Well, I can tell you all about the 26 enzymes that require manganese as a cofactor. I can tell you about the biological cycle and the different organisms that make it available for the plant and that need it for their own metabolism also." Ask him why he was interested as a veterinarian, because 15 years ago we thought we had too much manganese. The recommendation for the dairy nutritionist was to cut the rate back. We cut it back in the ration. At the same time, we started feeding Roundup Ready crops. Dr. Dunham said that he was concerned because he has dairy and swine producers going out of business because of high mortality, morbidity. That was in spite of all the drugs that he's providing. Have other veterinarians make the same comment. Can't keep them healthy. Have to have manganese for liver function, for your defense reaction. Doesn't matter if you're applying an antibiotic or other drugs. All they do is predispose those organisms to the natural immune system of the body. If you compromise that, they're not going to be very effective for you also. Pretty hard to find manganese in sufficiency in any of the large animals that have been necropsied by Iowa State Veterinary Lab. Same thing with vitamin B12. A rare commodity in the liver anymore. You say, well, what's glyphosate have to do with vitamin B12? That's cobalt. Glyphosate has a chelating stability constant almost 1,000 times stronger for cobalt than it even has for manganese. It's about 1,000 times for manganese more than calcium and magnesium. Look at the other nutrients. Data that Dr. Jeffrey Shepard, veterinary pathologist at University of Minnesota, reported last February at the veterinary conference. A 5-year study trying to understand birth defects, stillbirths, and other problems in cattle. Said it all came down to the fact that 100% of those animals were deficient in manganese. The surprising thing was that 60% of those that were born normal were also deficient in manganese. You can see the arthritic characteristics, knobby joints, bones. You have to have manganese in order to move calcium into the bone structure. We're not getting it in the feed and the food we're consuming. And then he looked at the bunch of the feed sources. What he found for his high is about what we used to see 20 years ago as more the average. If it has glyphosate with it, it's not going to be available physiologically. May show up in an ICP analysis, but physiologically it's chelated. Can't turn that ignition on. With gene flow, again, we see that movement. Genetic engineering is more like a virus infection than it is a breeding program. It has very little similarity to a sexual breeding development program. You have, in a normal breeding program, you have all of the regulatory genes that are moved with that particular gene trait that you're trying to incorporate in the plant. In order to get the genetically engineered gene to even express itself, we have to have the cauliflower mosaic virus genes. We have to have antibiotic-resistant genes. We've changed the integrity of the genetic structure. Those are very promiscuous types of genes that can move then both through pollen, but also through the soil microorganisms and indications now through our own intestinal microorganisms. In 2002, United Stock Growers gave testimony before the Senate Ag Committee. They said that there are two conditions that are threatening the viability of the industry. One of them is premature aging. You take a prime beef to market, they're graded down like it was a 10 or 12-year-old cow that's being culled from the herd. The second one was reproductive failure, infertility, lost pregnancy. So the viability of the industry is threatened. 40 to 50% of pregnancies may be lost. Novidae lost 70%. We see the response here. This is a study in Iowa 4 years ago. Cattle fed non-GMO, GMO, and you see that premature aging. See with the GMO, a typical allergy response to those foreign proteins. You see that yellowing of the tallow around the stomach lining. Should be white. Doesn't command that prime price when it goes to market. Looks like an old cow. Reproductive failure. In 1998, we had a tremendous loss of pregnancies in horses, cattle, pigs. We couldn't figure out what the problem was. The veterinarians couldn't. Just went as an unknown cause. A veterinarian that continued his search in 2002 identified an entity that he was finally able to culture in 2005 in pure culture, performed Koch's postulates with it, where he can isolated it from a fetal tissue, cultured it in pure culture, reintroduced it, and reproduced the lost pregnancies. The entity was initially called a microfungus because when it's magnified 38 to 40,000 times, kind of looks like a small mold colony or fungal colony on the plate, on the electron microscope grid. It's a misnomer. Doesn't have anything to do with the fungus. It's just I was trying to give it a name so that it could be worked with. Under the scanning electron microscope, you can see what it looks like over on the far side. And when I showed that in London, some of the researchers working on mad cow disease, they kind of gasped and said it looks just like a prion. One of the possibilities, I personally not convinced that it's a prion. We have some initial DNA sequencing. Prion doesn't have DNA, it's self-replicating. And there's another entity also that is self-replicating that doesn't have DNA involved in health-related issues. This entity can cause reproductive failure, infertility in the male, and also loss of pregnancies in cattle, horses, sheep, pigs, poultry, and we have it in humans. Extremely broad range. November, Herds Dairyman last year had an article by two veterinarians that had surveyed a lot of dairies in North America and Mexico and said, why are so many cows losing pregnancies? That losing 20% is unacceptable. You're not going to stay in the dairy business with 20%, and yet, as United Stock Growers showed, 40 to 50% with some of their producers. You see 27, 25, 27% lost pregnancies. Every time that we've checked those herds with high pregnancy loss, high infertility, we find this new entity. We find it in very high concentrations. In the genetically engineered corn and soybeans, veterinarians initially found it went to the feed sources, found it in soybean meal. Since found it in silage, in the distiller's grain, any situation that is either fermented, has another disease with it, or has been exposed to glyphosate. Those are the conditions that show high concentrations of this abortogenic agent. We know that it causes infertility as well as miscarriage. It'll kill a chicken embryo in 24 to 48 hours. So it can also be found in some of the animal products. Its effect on plants is that we see an extension of the typical symptom for sudden death syndrome or for Goss's wilt. In Goss's wilt, rather than just seeing that necrotic lesion, leaf lesion, you'll see an extension from that. Looks like the tissue had been frozen in the middle of July. That gray-green type of a cast with the water soaking, typical of the bacterium, but the color doesn't go brown. It stays in that gray-green area.